Hey guys, it's attorney Edward Littlejohn for another edition of Ask Ed Live. Today we're going to be talking about special needs trust and kind of what a special needs trust is, the two different types of special needs trust, and what the difference between the special needs trusts are. So the first thing I want to let you know is that if you have any questions, be sure to like, comment, or share so that we can answer those questions, and you can also get updates on other videos for me asking or answering questions that you guys may have when it comes to probate and estate planning matters. So now that we're going to begin, I want to let you know that a special needs trust is a type of trust that protects the assets of somebody who's on some sort of disability or minor children. Okay. And so here's the scenario. Somebody is on disability and they are not going to be able to work in the future. And so their parents have accumulated a substantial amount of assets throughout their life. And now they want to transfer those assets to their children upon their death. However, even though it's a substantial amount, the assets are not significant enough to take care of the child, the disabled child, for their entire life, right? And so what happens is people have looked for ways to protect the Medicaid benefits or the government benefits and still allow their child to inherit the money. Hence the special needs trust. Now, the way it works is the special needs trust will own the assets. And so if your loved one passes away, so if a parent passes away, those assets won't go to their disabled child. The assets would go into a special needs trust. Once those assets are in the special needs trust, then the trustee manages and controls the assets, and they have the discretion to supply care beyond the basic needs. So typically it's discretionary. So for example, the disabled child could still receive all their Medicaid benefits. They could make sure if they had housing benefits would be protected. They would still get their medical benefits as protected. But the trustee would have the ability to fully furnish the home, right? Make sure they had good clothes. It's just like a little bit of supplement. And it's like a supplemental trust, or what we call a special needs trust. Now, the big thing to know is that there are two main types of special needs trust. The main types are a first party trust and a third party special needs trust. Now, first party means you're setting the trust up for yourself, right? So if I was disabled and I were going to inherit some benefits, I could set up a first party special needs trust. Now, typically, if I can't set it up myself, then what happens is it might have been identified in my parents' will or somebody else's will. And if it's identified in their will, then they would set up this first party, or it could be a third party special needs trust, set up via will. But the other one is the third party special needs trust. And the biggest difference between the first party and the third party special needs trust are really what happens when your loved one passes. A third party special needs trust is when a parent foresees that their child is going to be on some sort of disability and they want to set up this special needs trust for their child's benefit so they don't disinherit their government or they don't lose qualification for their government services, and they can also inherit. But again, the biggest difference is what happens to the assets once the beneficiary dies. Okay. Now, let's talk about this. I'm going to draw it out on the board for you. So we have our loved one, and then we have the person, loved one and the disabled person, and then we have our assets. And the assets are held in our special needs trust. Okay? And so with those assets being held in the special needs trust, the disabled person can have access to them by way of the special needs trust. But under a first party trust, which means the disabled person set it up for themselves versus the third party where the loved one may have set it up in advance for the disabled person. Under a first party special needs trust, the disabled person is required to pay the Medicaid benefits back. So let's say this disabled person lives for 20 years and then passes away. There may be some assets that remain in the special needs trust. And if the disabled person has children, those assets do not go to the child, but rather those assets would be paid to reimburse the Medicaid, pay any state taxes, any local taxes, okay, and any administrative fees. Once all those fees are paid, then their children would inherit. But under a third party special needs trust, there is no requirement to reimburse Medicaid or any government agency, which is why the third party special needs trust may be beneficial for you and your family. If you're concerned about which special needs trust is best for you and your loved one, give us a call. Because remember, where there's a will, there's a way. Where there's no will, then there's probate.